just restate the definition of ENSO. I think I understand as I'm following the data through the presentation, but maybe just give a little bit better description of what it is and how you came at the ENSO terminology.
El Nino is warmer than average temperatures across kind of the central and eastern Pacific. And La Nina is cooler than average temperatures. Right? Or am I getting that backwards? Yeah. In the Pacific, yeah, the eastern Pacific. And there's a technical definition based on the actual sea surface temperatures over a small area, and it has to be above or below a certain threshold for 3 months or 5 months. 3 months, right?
Tahiti.
5 months? Anyway.
5-month running average.
But again, that's all that kind of stuff where that doesn't recognize the unique aspects of any given year. It's just trying to crunch everything into 3 categories: La Nina, El Nino.
Here's why it really matters. What we're talking about here is an area that's often called the Pacific Warm Pool. It's north and south of the equator, about 10 degrees. That is the single most significant source of terrestrial heat to any place on Earth. There is more heat that is emitted from the tropical Pacific than anywhere else. And as a result, it tends to really dominate world weather patterns and climate. An overall change in the temperature of the ocean can cause significant changes in literally every continent. During an El Nino, as Jim said, the waters off South America tend to warm up, but the overall Pacific temperature is higher. And literally, on a short-term basis, El Ninos cause global warming. La Nina tends to be cool off South America. Overall temperatures in the Pacific warm pool are below average, and global temperatures go down. Not every place goes down in temperature, but overall they tend to do it. So this area tends to dominate world weather patterns, and that's why we look at it so much.
The base definition of these events we call ENSO, which stands for El Nino Southern Oscillation. Most weather textbooks say there's 2 phases, when in fact there's actually 3 phases. There's the El Nino phase, which is the warm phase. There's the cold phase we call La Nina, and then there's ENSO, neutral, swimming in the middle. And the base index is what we call SOI, Southern Oscillation Index. It really looks at the the pressure departure between Darwin and Tahiti Island, looking at that pressure difference. And during El Nino events, the pressure differences tend to flatten out, and therefore the winds die out. But that's the real base definition of SOI, which is kind of the driving component of SOI.
And I think it's interesting. One of the reasons we use SOI is because it's based on pressure differences, and pressure is a relatively easy thing to measure. We have good historical record. You can, pressure with a mercury barometer, you can measure it very accurately. So these records go back for a long time, and they're kind of a proxy actually then for the temperature across the Pacific Ocean. But yeah, SOI is kind of the base definition.
Thanks.
Maybe I don't need a mic. There you go. It sounds to me like, and looks to me like, that Pete Parsons is forecasting a slightly increased chance of an Arctic outbreak, an Arctic air outbreak, sometime during the winter, than would normally be the case, based on the ENSO new definition. Could you hear me anyway? Maybe could I hear from each of you? Do you agree with that? Do you also see a slightly increased chance of an Arctic air outbreak in our region, each of you, or not?
I disagree.
You disagree? Mike, you agree?
Yeah, definitely.
3 out of 4, nothing.
I didn't forecast, but we didn't have one last year, so maybe we're due.
One thing, the Arctic outbreak you're talking about, what I don't see happening is probably those oddball Arctics that come down out of from the north filling in. I think it's more prone to the gap Arctic outbreaks, gorge events. So now I think that's where you're gonna see your Arctic outbreak coming through.
Like that 98 snowstorm that went on, just like a 3-day ice and snow event where it just got sucked into the low levels, but there was no Arctic outbreak. Yeah.
Yeah, something sort of like that, but I do think, like you said, not the widespread Arctic alpha that's gonna affect the coast and everybody, but definitely the pathogens to be worried.
Well, not necessarily high aspect of the
Exactly.
bridges that would draw off over there and come out of the Yukon.
Right, right.
That's not so much of a-
Not so much that, but I think more of these, where you get the really Arctic air spilling through the Rockies back into the basin, and that just spills right out through our area.
Other questions from the audience?
While we're waiting, following through on that, that would mean you better chance for ice and snow in the Portland area, right, Clinton? You know, he's talking, but that would mean, you know, not so much Salem and Eugene, but Portland and vicinity. Yeah.
I have one question. Can you, I think it was Kyle was talking about over here, if you want to look at the effect of sunspots. How did it, generally speaking, what's the effect that sunspots have on the weather?
Well, in general, the sun does influence our weather just a little bit. What Landscheid's work found was that he actually came up with a computer model many years ago. Unfortunately, he died about 8 years ago, so he's no longer around to defend his work. But he found there was actually a very strong correlation as far as solar activity as measured with sunspots, as far as looking at particular events down here on Earth with El Nino and La Nina being one of them. He also developed a model too, looking at PDO, as far as when it was going to like flip into its different phases. His last prediction before he died was that the PDO was going to slip into the warm phase in the year 2016, which is not that far away. And although I didn't track his work on PDO for the ENSO events, he had a 100% track record being able to forecast ENSO events years in the future. Not months, not weeks, but years. And he was able to basically time as far as the peak of each one of these events. So he seemed to think there was a real strong connection between solar cycling and ENSO events down here on Earth. But the basic idea is that when you're on a sunspot maxima, you're basically having more radiation coming from the sun, bathing the Earth. That's going to definitely have an impact as far as how much energy the oceans are absorbing, as well as our atmosphere, whereas the sunspot minima, you're looking at nearly as much radiation coming down to hit the Earth. And of course, that's a little controversial, because some say that the sun doesn't play a huge role in our weather, when in fact, well, I think it does. It's just a question to what degree, and of course, there's a lot of indirects as far as how they get filtered down through the different layers of the atmosphere. We're still looking at the component pieces, but I think there was something to Landscheid's work.
Just to be clear, I didn't say that the sun doesn't have an effect. I just said it didn't do anything for that particular method that I was using. Also, my question, if we flip back to PDO by 2016, that's a relatively short cold phase PDO, isn't it?
No, we started the current cold phase in 1998. I know the problem when you're looking at PDO is that's such a long-term signal, it's really hard to say. I looked at papers a few years ago, it was published in the summer of 1998, where there actually was a wholesale reorganization of the ocean life up in the North Pacific, which is indicative of a shift in PDO. And this sort of happened in a matter of a few weeks, which was amazing. Same shift which happened in 1977, which was the last time we had a phase shift. But there's been no other wholesale reordering of the ocean life in the North Pacific since 98. So we've been in this cold phase since 98. So 98, 2016, so that'd be about 18 years. So that's about the same length of periodicity that we've been seeing PDO the last 100 years.
Really? I thought they were a little longer than that.
Well, 20 to 30 years.
Oh, Nate Mantua, I didn't go to that meeting, but what did Nate Mantua, he's the PDO master.
He said it's split in 2006, 2007. But there is plenty of debate to also suggest the 97 El Nino was responsible as well.
Was what?
Actually, as I recall, I had a big question mark over both 2007 or 6 and 1998.
He also suggested that this may not be a 25 or 30-year cold event either, or a negative event. We don't know until we look back at it. Other questions? Robert?
Yeah, I've been coming to this event for about 5 or 6 years, and this seems to be the biggest variety of analog years that we all have presented. Almost always there's overlaps between everyone. I assume this means we've got confusion all over the place, but does anyone remember hearing this sort of spread of analogs as much? Are we just in a very unusual spot and have less idea of what's happening?
I don't think in my case, I've seen as few years with strong correlations with the current year. Again, it was 2011 that matched up the best in mine, but you're right. Usually we have half a dozen decent years that we can latch onto, and I really didn't see any that I particularly liked. And I concur with what you say. Usually you see some similar years popping up in different presentations, and today there were none.
Or to summarize, we got nothing.
You know, one thing that comes up is that Oceanic Nino Index, 2008, and this could affect some of those analog years, 2008, 2009, remember there was that big cold December? That was, let me get this right, only 0.1 off for one of those 5 months from being a
La Nina.
La Nina.
Right.
So I heard, somebody told me a year or two ago, they said, oh, I consider that a La Nina year, it was so close. Well, then somebody the other day said, oh no, that was a neutral year, because officially it was neutral, but that's a man-made, somebody decided to put it right there. You know what I mean? That could have been considered one or the other. So we're talking about a mishmash of, like, I think you said several times we're on the warm side of neutral this year, as opposed to 2008, which was the cold side of neutral. So do you use that as an analog year or not? So.
This actually relates to the analog years. I'm just wondering with, you know, global industry around the globe adding to the heat, climate change, if you will, what would your models look like if you maybe threw out anything before 1970? Because you all have different analog years, and some of those are from the 50s and 60s.
Well, I could at least talk my own data here. When I look at the 20 years, I try and get a representative spread of data, at least 1 or 2 years from each decade, going all the way back from, well, my youngest years, 1947, my latest was 2010. So I try and do a little bit of representation, so I'm not skewing the data one way or the other. But again, I have to be consistent in what I'm looking at here. But I think the broader range of analog years you look at, I think the better you try and encapsulate that variability.
No, I think you raise a really good point, and we do have really quite good complete data, satellite data, buoy data, and so on back into the 1980s. But prior to that, the farther back you go, the hazier things tend to get. So, yeah, we're looking at a 100-year record, but a lot of the older data are based on some pretty sketchy information. So it might make sense just to look at 30 years. The problem is we have this PDO oscillation, which seems to have phases of 25 years or so, and it basically says we get half a cycle in the really good data. So we get desperate for data, I guess is the way I'd put it, and we use old data and pretend that it's just as good as the new data, even though we know it really isn't.
I would invite everyone to come back to this meeting about 2050, and we're going to be really good.
All this long-range stuff is well and good, but the real question is, are we going to have a hurricane force wind event out in Astoria on Monday?
Which side of Astoria? Odds are good.